Hi, my name is Anne Ratchet, and I am the owner and producer of Magistry Studios, and today I'd like to introduce Parlor Larping, which is one of the biggest things we do at Magistry Studios. So before we get into anything, the first thing I want to make a note of is that Parlor Larping is an active, living definition. It is changing by the day, all of the time, getting more complicated and sometimes a little bit more convoluted. So all of this is going to be more of a historical breakdown of where things started and not going to tell you where it's going to be headed because they're all kind of going in the same direction through cross-pollination. So let's get started. The best definition I have for parlor LARPing, based off of my experience with it is LARPing that is not combat skill focused. The major competitor is boffer LARPing, which is based off of actual combat skills with a lot of mechanics about being able to hit with a boffer weapon somebody else in a combat field. Parlor LARPing will have card mechanics, timer mechanics, negotiation mechanics in order to simulate that same type of thing of fighting, but it doesn't actually require player skill to do it. So that is the biggest summary of it all. As I said before, we're going to be going into the history of a lot of foundational styles seen in America. So let's start off with Vampire the Masquerade. Vampire the Masquerade is going to be the first style of LARP that really started making the name of parlor LARPing. It is probably the most famous parlor LARP in America, with Mind's Eye Society chapters all across the country, and quite a few games allow you to travel between them in order to bring your character and bring them to other parts of the country to play in other games as well. At its core, you're primarily acting out the RPG, Vampire the Masquerade, which is where a lot of LARPing in America got its original start, was through role-playing and acting out these usually tabletop games in a full bodies experience. Things that you can expect out of Vampire the Masquerade is usually high levels of politics, intrigue, and also very complicated social structures, because sometimes the social negotiations of these vampire endgames bleeds out into the greater world, into the actual social structure outside of the game. The next one I want to talk about is Secrets and Powers, also known as interactive literature. So this style of Secrets and Powers really first got its start on college campuses, such as in the Boston area and Stanford. It started off as a branch of an assassination game, where people would go around playing secret agents in daily life, and more information was layered on top. Originally, these games were designed to be one and done, because they had a lot of secrets that would come out in the game, and knowing any of that would change how it was played, so you would be invited to play this game that would never ever run again. They had pre-written worlds with quite a bit of world document, and pre-written characters, all of which who had some amount of secrets that they are hiding and possibly want to keep hidden, and powers that allow them to interact with other people, hence the name Secrets and Powers. A lot of the times when these games were written, they were, again, being written for one-time, one-shots. So a lot of the characters were written specifically to be played by this one player. And so it allowed a lot of assumption about character skill or character interest, and also allowed for a slightly more predictable outcome in the style of how the game ran. One of the things that is typically recommended is to expect to read a lot. Some of the games are very short and have about 10 pages of reading, including world document, but sometimes you end up with a 4-hour game with over 60 pages of reading just for that 4-hour game, just your one character and the world document. So it was just a thing to warn people about as they got in, is there's usually quite a bit of prep. Okay, so now on to American Freeform and Nordic. Nordic is probably the most internationally known style of parlor LARPing, and America had its own little version that we created ourselves out of a convergent evolution. If you haven't seen the little bit about story gaming I introduced, I highly recommend watching that video first before continuing on this, because it will make the American Freeform information make a lot more sense. The things that are common between American Freeform and Nordic is one, that it is community-focused gaming. Both of them are reflectant of the gaming cultures and social cultures outside of the game that are expected to be brought in. For example, be a fan of the other characters at the table, and the players are more important than the story. So as a result, take care of everyone within the game before the game. Then there also is thinking about what creates a good story, leading to different play styles, such as play to win, which was very popularized in Boffer-style games, where playing to win, playing to get the success was the major focus, versus with American Freeform and Nordic, you end up with play to lose or play to story, this idea where it is more interesting to have bad things happen to your character, or possibly plot interesting things to happen to your character, than just having a big success. And so you have some people who will play these games in order to play the most tragic story and get the most catharsis out of the story, instead of trying to have a big grand hurrah. So similar to how I said tabletop games ended up becoming LARPs, American Freeform started branching out of the story game community as people wanted to have a little bit more of a drive. One of the big things that happened was Gen Con at one point was telling a lot of LARP runners that they did not have a localized area to play, no private rooms. They were pretty much put in random hallways. And LARPers still wanted to LARP, even if they were in inopportune situations, so they created the Golden Cobra competition, which still runs to this day. The Golden Cobra competition is a American Freeform LARP competition where short games that are designed for pick up and play, usually 4 pages or less, though more can be submitted, it just won't be judged. And these games were designed to iterate and design these games that could be played in an open area surrounded by a bunch of people and still be safe and really enjoyable for the people playing the game. You also saw a pattern of there would be no costuming. People were wearing whatever they want, and anything that was a costuming piece was a propped piece. For example, a boa to define somebody as a drag queen, or a hat in order to say somebody was an heiress. That would be pretty much the extent of costuming, if at all done, and usually provided by the GM. They have minimal prep time. So again, with a game that is in total 4 pages or less, usually you run through the entire instruction of how to run the game, and then you just dive into it. It doesn't take a lot of prep time. It doesn't require pre-casting. You just end up having an opportunity to get in and play the game as fast as possible, which became really popular. If there are pre-written characters, which many times there are not, the pre-written characters are on the short side, maybe at most 3 paragraphs. So as a result, there's a lot of room for exploration, so just enough to give you a baseline in order how to start the game, and then from there, a lot of opportunity for you to play to find out, or a way of waiting for opportunity within game to make really cool strategic moves for a really cool story at the end of the day. And as mentioned, again, a lot of these games were designed for convention, so a 4-hour time slot or less. Finally, we're getting into Nordic LARP, which I'm just going to put the asterisk in of I am not a European LARP expert, so this is my understanding of Nordic LARP, but there are plenty of people who write academic papers on the topic, and I highly recommend you look them out and seek them out, because there's some really cool cultural exchange happening within this. So let's start off with the inherent values of it. is Scandinavian culture in general is very community oriented and about lifting people. It is about work-life balance, and these things all got built into Nordic LARPing. It's one of the reasons why Nordic LARP has lost a lot of its terminology and a lot of its value as a term within the American population, is because there's assumptions about Nordic LARP that don't transform into American culture because we aren't taught the Scandinavian cultural values, we have a different work-life balance, we have different financial opportunities. And so that really changes a lot. One of the things that Nordic LARP took advantage of was how cheap castles are in Europe. And so a lot of the really big games allowed them to find venues for 100, 200 people very easily with very little cost. So a weekend would be $65 versus for America, the alternative would probably be $500 minimum in our current economy for the same game because just of how expensive venues are. There is a pattern of pre-written characters that have been pre-casted, and this gives people 6 months or longer to put together elaborate costumes, put together physical representations or phys reps of various stuff in their plot, put together props or little activities to fill their pockets, and all of these things are expected to be designed and put into for a Nordic LARP. There is also a lot of immersive sets, which immersive also does not have the same definition in America, but we're just going to roll with it. The big things is because you were in a castle in the first place, it allowed you to believe you were somewhere else very quickly, very easily. And so you would dive in and have all of this opportunity to add a piece of mistletoe, and all of a sudden it is Christmas in the castle, and it feels like Christmas in a castle. You also end up with people who are great set designers who were able to put together things like portals or torture rooms or jails, grand feasts, and have that all really make sense and dive you into the experience of the Nordic LARP. This sounds like a lot of work, and it is. And part of that is because there's an assumption about volunteer time in Nordic LARP. There is a lot of socioeconomic factors that allow people to volunteer in Nordic countries and in most of Europe that has a much higher cost for time and finances than does in America, especially because Europe is known for much better vacation policies, and America typically has, 2 weeks of paid vacation time in an entire year. So taking a week off in Europe to create a big event for your friends is much more reasonable than it is for in America. And finally, the last thing is we've talked about a lot of games being 4 hours or less. There are some Nordic games that are only 4 hours or possibly 5 hours, depending on which one it is. However, the majority of the games that have been seen are weekend-long games, if not longer than a weekend. And so, as a result, it gives you a lot of time to tell bigger stories, grander stories, and actually play out the character development instead of having to make a split-second decision and then run with it for the rest of the 2 hours. So we get to modern day. There has been a lot of bleed between the styles, between people wanting to play more LARP and so taking any opportunity to play a game and bringing their own historical play styles, values with them into the new environment. There's also been conferences in order to have tete-a-tetes between a lot of the great speakers and a lot of the great academics, because LARP academia is really deep and really dedicated at this point. It's really fun to watch. So some of those conventions you might want to look up Living Games, which no longer runs, but had quite a bit of information in America between different styles and camps in different parts of the country. You also have international festivals like Festival in Europe, where people are bringing in brand new games in order to say, I figured out a cool thing, do we want to have a look at it? And this is allowing a lot of people to iterate what is going on. We also had various terms, as I mentioned, Nordic, start to die out because they just no longer have meaning. They're a good marketing ploy, but they lost what they originally meant when we defined that term as Nordic. So from here, it's going to be really interesting to see what is the next step, what is going to happen. I am really excited to be part of the process of bridging the gap. I like to say I've taken a little bit of each of the styles and tried to take it in a direction of making it my own. We'll see what you create, we'll see what I create, and we'll meet back here in, say, a year. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, give this a hype, and as always, I'll see you next time. Bye.